Welcome to today's session of the Business and Trade Select Committee, where we are looking at the topic of regulation in the UK economy and regulation for growth. Thank you so much to David, Sarah and Sarah for joining us this afternoon. I'm grateful for you being with us today and not in Leeds. David, perhaps I could start with you. Like me, I think you're old enough to remember a great book by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt a few years ago called This Time It's Different. And you'll remember their conclusion. The financial sector has a long history of innovating around regulations, and liberalisation is often accompanied by lending booms that end badly. Do you think that today's deregulatory announcements made by the Chancellor increase the risk of a financial crisis in the future?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us to give evidence. In response to that question, we've been very careful in terms of tailoring the proposals that have been announced today to make sure that they safeguard resilience whilst providing greater proportionality and efficiency in regulation. From a PRA perspective, we've been very focused on how we can support growth for the last, for a long time, but it's been turbocharged over the last couple of years since we got a new legislative objective around international competitiveness and growth. But we're very clear in taking that forward that the biggest contribution that we can make at the PRA and the Bank of England to growth is to ensure that there's financial stability, because that's a necessary condition for sustainable economic growth.
Are you able to assure Parliament this afternoon that the regulatory changes announced today do not increase the risk of another financial crisis?
So from a PRA perspective, the proposals that we've announced today have been carefully tailored to preserve what we consider to be an appropriate level of resilience, whilst making our regulatory framework more efficiently, more proportionately, and to support innovation. And I can give examples of where we have done that.
Well, I think at this stage we're interested in the bottom line, which is, has the risk of a financial crisis today gone up, or is it the same as it was yesterday?
So again, from a PRA perspective, since the financial crisis, we have built overall resilience in the system. Overall levels of banking capital, for example, have risen significantly, but they started plateauing in about 2019 when we reached the optimal level of capital that the Financial Policy Committee had set out for resilience in the banking system. And that's optimal because it appropriately balances it balances resilience with growth. All the changes we've announced today, including our implementation of the international banking standards under Basel III, maintain that level of resilience within the system. And alongside that, last week the Financial Policy Committee announced that it was going to do a refresh of the analysis around the optimal level of capital to make sure that we were clear on what is the optimal level to appropriately balance resilience and growth.
So what I haven't heard you say is no. The risk of financial crisis has gone down.
I can be very clear with you, Chair, if you like. The announcements that the PRA have made today, and the PRA and the broader Bank of England, preserve what we consider to be an appropriate level of resilience within the system that balances growth and resilience. The two go hand in hand. Financial stability and growth go hand in hand.
Just so we're super clear, the risk of a financial crisis has not gone up. So, simple yes or no answer, really.
Correct. The risk of a financial crisis, from the PRA's perspective, in banking insurance, has not gone up because we've maintained the same level of resilience in the system.
Good. Thank you very much. Sarah Pritchard, you've also made some announcements. Do your announcements increase the risk of a financial crisis or leave them unchanged?
I would say, much like David has already covered, that the announcements made today are actually consistent with the direction of travel that we've been working on in the FCA, particularly since we set out our new 5-year strategy in March. We are very supportive of all of the FCA announcements that are made in today's strategy. And critically, what I think you've heard us say repeatedly, particularly times with the launch of our strategy back in March, is that this is the right moment in time to look at the calibration of the regulatory system. It is important, though, that there is a public debate around risk appetite. If we think about this from a consumer perspective, of course we've got a significant consumer remit. We are prompting conversations around where should that risk appetite be set in relation to mortgages, for example. If we see greater numbers of people with access to mortgages, what's the risk then in terms of repossessions in the event of an economic downturn? We think that this is the right time to have that conversation, but we think it's important that it is a publicly debated and then supported.
There have been 250 financial crises in 66 countries since the Napoleonic War, and every single one of those was preceded by a period of financial liberalisation during which politicians convinced themselves that this time it was different. Do you think this time is now different to the period that led up to financial crises in the past, and if so, how?
I would say that it's a great pleasure that we work alongside the Bank of England, whose primary remit is the financial stability remit. There's nothing in today's set of announcements that causes me any different concern to that David has set out. The one additional factor I'd just like to highlight is we've been talking through our strategy around acting proportionately and looking at regulatory burden. One of the areas that we have been focusing on is where can we switch off data where we don't need it anymore. We've been taking action to switch off data returns affecting 16,000 firms, for example. But I'm also really clear we do need data to do our job. We need data from market participants so that we can manage market risk, manage the risk of harm to consumers. And so it's about having the balance.
Will today's reforms trigger an increase in lending to consumers?
Overall, I'm really hopeful that the set of measures announced today will support the part of our strategy which talks about helping consumers navigate their financial lives. You might have seen that we've done a huge amount of work to
Can you just translate that for us? So does that mean that lending will increase or stay at a stable level?
Well, if I take mortgages, for example, we are already having a discussion around the rule set that exists currently in relation to mortgages. We think that there is possibility to increase lending to consumers and for mortgages, looking at taking into account different types of financial history. That is signalled in today's set of announcements. It's a discussion paper that we have already kicked off, and we're very keen for views. We think this is important. This question of risk appetite is an important question that there is public discourse.
Would that be characterised, do you think, as a lending boom which is about to unfold once these regulations are reformed?
I hope that you see that throughout the set of regulatory reforms that we've been working on for some time at the FCA, we are guided by our statutory objectives. We have an overall objective to make sure that markets function well. We have three primary objectives and then a secondary. And so with every piece of reform that we are working on, we are guided by that. We think it is important that the market functions well. There needs to be market integrity, appropriate levels of protection for consumers, and then secondary, international competitiveness and growth. And that is how we are addressing all of our regulatory reform and seeking open views through our consultation process where we're taking those things forward.
How do you foresee the risk of a speculative rise in asset prices if lending increases?
I think if I go back to the importance of recognising that the financial system is not a risk-free system. There's risk currently. Markets change. You might have heard Nikhil Rathi, our CEO, talk about living in an area of predictable volatility. I think what is essential in those environments is, firstly, do regulators collectively have the data that they need to be able to do their job? And then secondly, do they work well together in terms of sharing that information so that if there is market risk, interventions can be taken if necessary or rule sets recalibrated? And actually that's one of the real strengths I see in today's set of announcements, which reflect many months of work between all of us, is the way that we've been working through the set of proposals. They are all proposals that we recognise, or I recognise. I think David has said he recognises too. So there is strength that I think can be taken from that. It is very important, though, that we all work through this public question of risk appetite and make sure that we are thoughtfully guided by the statutory objectives that Parliament has set us.
Is there a risk that asset prices will now rise if lending is increased?
I think we need to step through the reforms that are signalled today. You see volatility in asset prices driven through all sorts of global economic conditions. The international environment is changing. There are a range of different factors at play. I think regulation is one aspect, but the general environment in which we all operate, in particular the UK being a global connected system, there is no one point that I would refer to in terms of that package today as saying that that will cause any different sorts of market risk or volatility. But if I go back to the importance of making sure that we have data to do our job and working well together, I think that's essential.
So are you satisfied that today you have both the data and the regulations that you need to stop a speculative lending boom and speculative asset rises?
I think on the data question, we are already doing an awful lot of work to look at, do we have the right data and are we collecting it in a timely and proportionate manner? There is some further work that we're doing looking at the European legislation that we've inherited, AI-FMD, that we're working on in the early part of next year. That will be quite critical in terms of where should the UK calibrate its data going forwards. That is already work that we were taking forward. Again, it's underpins some of what you see in today's announcements.
And David, are you satisfied that after today's announcements you will be left in control of enough controls to stop a repetition of the events that led up to the 2008 financial crash?
I'm very satisfied that banks that are doing the bulk of the lending will be appropriately capitalised, and that will constrain that the capital they need to hold against individual loans will ensure that that lending is done in a prudent fashion.
Just turning to a very different topic, Sarah, Pritchard, the Financial Conduct Authority has announced earlier this week that you're going to pare back corporate transparency rules. This is obviously something that strikes at the heart of the limited liability partnership. We give companies limited liability in return for transparency so that we can understand what's going on. I don't understand why this is being positioned as a measure to cut red tape, because companies have to produce the accounts. We just asked them today to be sent to Companies House so that they can be made publicly available. Why is corporate transparency going backwards?
I think you're referring to the prospectus reforms that we have just concluded, as you say. I believe they were put out formally this morning. Those set of reforms are part of our overall package of reforms to ensure that wholesale markets and capital markets can thrive in the UK. What we have changed is the requirement for a further prospectus on further issuance. So nothing changes in relation to the information that needs to be available at the time of first listing. But what we have said is we have raised the threshold from 20% to 75% for a prospectus requirement for further issuance of share capital. That is, as you say, a significant shift. There may be situations where companies choose to use a prospectus at a much lower level, but we have taken the feedback into account carefully through the consultation process and believe that that was the right point to calibrate, thinking about all of our objectives and also thinking about the importance of our secondary objective in deciding where to balance the rule set. I should say that underpinning all of our work in relation to capital markets and wholesale markets is perhaps a slight shift in philosophy, one that has moved away from perhaps hard-edged gates and checks in advance of activity being taken with checks made by the regulator to one which is focused on disclosure and transparency. So I agree with you that disclosure and transparency is really critical.
It sounds like you just watered it down.
I think what we're focused on is making sure that investors can make their own decisions. As I said, there may well be situations in which companies will choose to use a prospectus at a lower level. We have not changed any of the requirements for first listing.
But of further listings you have.
We have.
How does that improve transparency?
We are saying that for further listings, we believe that the right balance is struck by removing some of the grit in the system around.
That grit's called transparency.
I think we're very clear that transparency is important. We're also very clear that investors can make their own decisions. So the market abuse regime remains in place for all companies that are listed. The requirement for a prospectus at the further issuance of capital, there was broad support for lifting the threshold at the level at which that was mandated.
Well, we're obviously talking to different people, because I haven't picked up that kind of ambition for less transparency. We want to see more, I think, because we want to know that the limited liability regime has maintained its integrity.
Transparency is important, and I think it's important to reflect the new prospectus rules alongside the existing market abuse regime, which will require companies to continue to make disclosures as needed, subject to that regime.
Okay, and then on the question of Shein, thank you very much indeed for your letter back. I'm not expecting you to comment on that particular case, but you have provided us with an assurance that for companies like Shein, as indeed for any other company, there will not be, despite what you've just told us, any watering down of disclosure requirements around, for example, labour standards.
As you say, I can't go into the specifics of an individual case, but the requirements on us at prospectus for initial listing are unchanged. And I think the other important thing, this is a point that has been touched on earlier, is we believe that high standards are a good thing for the UK. High standards support sustainable growth. When there is talk about regulatory recalibration and regulatory reform, we are guided by our statutory objectives, market integrity, making sure that markets function well. We have repeatedly said this should not be looked at as a race to the bottom, and I think I give you my assurance that in relation to the prospectus reforms that you have talked about and the previous correspondence that we've entered into in relation to that company, there is nothing that has changed as a result of today's announcements.
And you won't be browbeaten by the London Stock Exchange, which is, for understandable reasons, seeking more companies to list. You won't be browbeaten by them into weakening reporting or disclosure standards.
I think as a regulator, it's important that we are guided by our statutory objectives, the objectives that Parliament have given us. Sometimes we have to make difficult and unpalatable decisions, and I can assure you that notwithstanding the real focus on growth in our strategy, we talk about deepening trust, rebalancing risk, supporting growth and improving lives. And it is that whole ecosystem that works together that will enable us to be successful in our strategy. It is no one element of that at the expense of the others.
Well, there should be an interesting test case then. Thank you. Charlie Maynard.
Thank you, Chair. I refer members to my register of interests. Sarah Cardell, hi. Thank you for being here. How do you see and manage the tension between maintaining free and open markets and going for growth?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to come this afternoon. So look, I think there's no, in principle, tension between those two objectives, actually. If we think about our statutory mandate at the CMA, it's about promoting competition and protecting consumers. And both of those things are foundational to driving economic growth. We know that open, dynamic, competitive markets will deliver greater levels of investment, innovation, should deliver higher levels of productivity. So those sort of foundational principles are clear. Likewise, consumer protection builds trust and confidence in markets, and that spurs spending and creates a level playing field. So far, so good. I think a lot of it also, though, does come down to the choices that we make about the work that we choose to do, and importantly, how we go about that work. And that's been really the laser focus of our real drive to support the growth mission, without, in any sense, stepping away from that primary mandate to promote competition and protect consumers.
I mean, what I'm worried about, particularly with your very quick exit of your prior chair, is there was read the FT or any other newspaper, it seemed to be a message from government to say, if you're in big tech or have dominant market share, we are going to go more lightly on you. And as a dominant player, you may get, you have more leeway to run competitors off the road, buy them, and that stifles innovation and stifles free competition. And I'm looking for you to put me wrong on that, because that was certainly, a message widely spoken about in the financial press.
So we have been very clear, I have been very clear personally, Doug Gurr, our new interim chair, has been very clear, and the government has equally, through including the strategic steer we've had issued in May this year, that protecting consumers, promoting competition are still the CMA's priority. We should do that with a growth-focused lens, but that doesn't mean stepping away. It doesn't mean allowing anti-competitive mergers. It doesn't mean stepping back from competition enforcement. It doesn't mean stepping away from our new functions to deliver effective competition in digital markets. And I think, the clear message coming, as I say, from myself, from Doug, from government, from the steer, and also in the actions we are taking, reflects that. That can be done, to pick up on some of the themes from Sarah and David, that can be done in a way that supports growth, that is proportionate, that is delivered quickly. All the elements, I've talked quite a bit about my 4Ps framework to deliver growth: pace, predictability, proportionality, process, engagement. I think those are key. I think we have a real opportunity here in the UK as a CMA now to deliver a step change in the way that we go about our work, which improves business and investor confidence, which is absolutely critical. And of course, the vast majority of businesses in the UK are doing the right thing by their customers and by their competitors. But it doesn't mean that we are sacrificing at all the important focus on ensuring that drive for competitive markets.
Thank you. And in terms of structural versus behavioural remedies, could you say a little bit as to where you're headed or whether there's any change in direction on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, actually, of how we are thinking about the choices that we make and how we go about our work. If you think about merger control, the vast majority of mergers are entirely unproblematic from a competition perspective. And there will be a handful of deals every year that we look at which raise material competition concerns. Of that handful, some of those deals can be, or some of those concerns can be addressed through remedies, whether those are structural or behavioural. And in the sort of minute number of cases, a prohibition will be required because it simply can't be resolved through remedies. Now, what we have said, and I think our work on the Vodafone 3 merger is a good example of this, is we need to be open to a full set of remedies to look case by case, what are the issues, what are the concerns, and what are the remedies that are appropriate to address those. We have been very clear, again, that we will only accept remedies that are fully effective in addressing our concerns. But if you take something like the Voda 3 example, actually what we saw there was a merger where the parties had put forward very substantial evidence of investment benefits that could flow from that deal. We thought that the evidence on those investment benefits was pretty strong. Where we had doubts was the certainty about whether that investment would actually flow through. And so we put in place remedies, actually working in this case very closely with Ofgem, using that regulatory regime to lock in that commitment to deliver those investment benefits.
Yeah, I mean, I worked in M&A for 24 years, and I'm really, really spooked by anything which lightens up on the structural remedies, because M&A exists to reduce competition. And if we're heading towards trust us, it's all going to be behaviourally sorted, and that might be for 1 or 2 years, but structurally you've lost a competitor, and that causes a lot of problems for the market and for the consumers by extension. So I really hope we are sticking to our structural remedies where they're required.
I would agree, and we have always said, and I don't think we have moved away from this, that there is a high bar for accepting behavioural remedies. They will be appropriate in certain cases, and I think Voda 3 is a good example of that, not least because you have a sectoral regulator in place who can carry out that ongoing monitoring exercise to ensure compliance, and that's a big factor for us when we normally look at behavioural remedies. Take another couple of cases we've looked at this year, the Synopsys Ansys deal, the GXO Wincanton deal. We have required structural remedies in those cases for precisely the reasons that you say. We are undertaking a review at the moment of our approach to merger remedies. It's important that we have an open mind here, but be in no doubt, I really want to reassure the committee on this fact, there is no watering down of our requirement to see effective remedies.
Why do you think the Chancellor had you in her sights when she was concerned about regulators not contributing to UK growth? In what way were you impeding the growth of our economy?
So, I think there was a broader question about the regulatory environment across the UK. Is that delivering, is that delivering an environment where businesses and investors really have confidence that the UK is a good place to do business and invest? And the CMA does play a part in that. And
so your behaviour in the past as a regulator had somehow negatively affected investor confidence?
I think that there was a perception in some quarters, to take the example of merger control, that the CMA had become the merger policeman of the world, that the CMA was taking an outsized approach on mergers. I think when you look at the facts, that's not the case. When you look at the number of deals that we blocked year on year, it's a handful year on year, and it is not out of kilter with the approach taken in other jurisdictions like the EU and the US.
So you had to take action to affect the perceptions.
I think there was
rather
a real
than change the material nature of what you do.
And that perception was creating a real risk, is the way I would put it. The perception had got to a level where, and I spent quite a bit of time last year talking directly to business and investors, really to test this for myself. And I heard this message quite clearly. And that's the reason why, in part, my focus over the last 6 months has been so much on how we go about our work through this 4Ps framework, because that is what we can do to give assurance that we will move with pace, we will be proportionate, we will be predictable. But, to the earlier question, be in no doubt that we will take action where we see concerns. And so we're not watering down our approach, but I think it is important to give that confidence about the regulatory environment. And I think the UK is actually incredibly well placed to deliver that.
Good point.
Just to follow up on that, perhaps go to Sarah Pritchard on that. So the UK has the lowest levels of investment in the G7. When I speak to businesses, they do say to me that, I'm afraid to say, the CMA and the FSA are part of the problem for that. Do you see yourselves as part of the problem for that? And if so, what are you doing to fix it?
I think it's quite right that we are focused as the FCA on measures that we can take to support growth, and we're clear that we can do that in several ways. Do we have the regulatory framework that creates some of the infrastructure for some of the investment decisions? So you might have seen us really push forward on creation of a new private intermittent securities and capital exchange system called PICES. Do we have the architecture, the infrastructure to enable companies to stay private longer, but enable them to raise capital and then hopefully choose to stay in the UK and maybe consider choosing to publicly list? So I think we have a role to play in creating the environment for that. I think regulators also have a role to play in how they operate. Do we have the regulatory certainty and predictability? Are we operationally efficient? And do we create the safe for experimentation? You may be familiar with our innovation services that we have at the FCA, a really, really good track record, and we have really scaled them, particularly reaching into AI in recent months. We've supported over 1,000 firms through our innovation pathway services, and our data shows us of those firms that enter those innovation pathway services, they're 50% more likely to receive funding, and then they're on average they will raise 15% more capital. So I think that's something that we can do that will help firms thrive and create investment.
Do you think there is a perception problem? Because Sarah Cardell talked a bit about when she came into the role, speaking to investors, trying to understand what that is. Do you think you have that? And if so, have you tried to understand what that is?
I think it's very important that we are out speaking publicly to different groups of stakeholders around the work that we're doing, seeking to test whether it is calibrated in the right way. I think it is important to reflect, particularly if we think about global markets within the UK, that we do that internationally, and that we're speaking to our firms that are, some of which are global in nature and some of which are domestic in nature. I hope you've seen that the FCA has really sought where we have had really significant regulatory reform. We have been doing an awful lot of convening, running policy sprints. Our work on creating a new form of retail investment advice, targeted support, is a really great example of that in terms of the approach that we've taken to develop that rule set. There's clearly other factors at play in relation to investment decisions, but I do think it's important that regulators are out listening. I think it's important that we create the right regulatory framework. I think it's important that we also take the step back and think about where are the other aspects that might be in play: skills, training, financial capability. What's the whole ecosystem and what's our role within that?
Yeah. So you take some responsibility for investment in the UK.
I think it's very important. One of the things you might have seen in the strategy set out today is the FCA, alongside the PRA, alongside the City of London, putting its support into the Office for Financial Investment, what's otherwise simply known as the concierge service. That is a really great example of us recognising that the FCA has a role to play and putting resources behind that.
And then just on the perception problem for investors, do you feel like you're trying to tackle that? How are you going to track that? Are you going to measure it?
Yeah, so I think we do have a real responsibility, but I would say also a real opportunity, not just individually, but Sarah and myself, David, were on a panel a couple of weeks ago, speaking to a capital markets audience. I think the opportunity that we have as the UK actually to tell a really positive story about our joined up approach and the pro-business and pro-investment environment that creates, without any of us stepping away from our respective statutory duties, but that sort of shifting the dialogue, I think is hugely important. A couple of other things I would say from a CMA perspective, we've been speaking a lot to stakeholders. We hear a lot of calls also for the CMA to do more to help unlock opportunities for investment, for growth. Procurement, I know, is a big area of concern for the committee. That's something we hear repeatedly. How can we help government in that space? We're providing advice on defence. We've got our market study in relation to infrastructure for road and rail. In terms of measuring impact, to your question, I think it's key. We need to not just talk the talk, but actually walk the walk and deliver on that. So we already have a sort of well-established framework for looking at our direct impact. We're working harder on that, also thinking about indirect impact, but also the feedback that we hear directly from stakeholders, both in terms of their engagement and experience of working with the CMA, but that wider perception of the UK regulatory environment and the role that the CMA has to play in that, I think, are all things that we should be held to account on. We will be reporting on that. We've just covered a framework for that in our latest annual report, and you should expect to see more from us on that.
Okay. And just to follow up on measuring, so pace, particularly around innovation, it's one of your 4 Ps. I think it's really vital. Again, it's a criticism I hear, if I'm being honest, with regulators in this country. Are you measuring that? What does that look like, so we can understand that you have made a significant impact there? Yeah,
so pace, I think, is key. I mean, obviously it depends on the particular project and investigation in question, but we've introduced, for example, KPIs on our merger control process to shorten the length of the phase 1 process. As I said, most mergers don't raise competition issues, so we want to get those to clearance as quickly as possible. We'll be looking at end-to-end impact on some of our lengthier competition investigations, moving in a more agile way. Sometimes we will look to resolve cases without needing to go to a full and final infringement decision. Other cases, we will take them to an infringement decision. We will litigate them through the courts because that's the right thing to do. But reporting back on pace overall across the different areas of our work, absolutely.
And just to Sarah Pritchard, on innovation, again, being honest, that is the criticism I often hear, is that there is businesses that are trying to do something that is perhaps slightly outside of the norm, and often it takes a long time for them to receive any kind of feedback on that from you. Is that a criticism you recognise, and is that something you're trying to try and improve?
I recognise, firstly, some of the historic issues that we've had around our speed of authorising new firms and applications, and we have invested a significant amount of effort in the FCA over the last few years to really reduce the timeframes for our authorisation decisions. Our metrics are tracking 99.1%, all of our statutory metrics are being hit, and today you might have seen some announcements for some further shortening in order that we can show that we are able to bring and authorise those new firms to market quickly. I do think it is important that when we're thinking about authorising firms, it is important that we maintain our standards. We see what has happened in years gone by where there hasn't been a strong standards taken at the authorisations gateway, and we have seen that result in consumer harm and then the difficulty then in acting once that harm is systemic. So we talk about speeding up our authorisation decisions, but much as Sarah has said, this isn't about watering down those standards. It's about working with firms to say, this is what good looks like, how can we help you? And actually we have just expanded our pre-application support service so that we can put real human beings in front of prospective applicants and talk them through the process. I think separately it's around enabling the safe space for experimentation. Financial services, the way that it operates, has changed significantly in the last 5 years and will continue to change and evolve. And that's where I do think some of our technology innovation services are world leading. We not only have our domestic innovation services, but we are part and we one of the founding members of the Global Financial Innovation Network. So how can we enable the safe space for experimentation, and particularly around use of AI? We have an AI laboratory. We have an open set of applications at the moment in a supercharged sandbox, a joint partnership with NVIDIA, to enable firms who want to test proofs of concept before they even come to us for authorisation.
Thank you. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. We've heard at this committee, and it's not a new issue, that UK firms struggle to access scale-up finance. So how can our regulators, and indeed the Bank of England, support UK businesses, UK scale-up businesses to grow?
Yeah, so it's really important for growth. It's really important for resilience that firms can build and grow and scale up, as you say. And a couple of things I would point out. So first of all, as part of today's announcements, we've, alongside working with Sarah and colleagues at the FCA, we've announced this a scale-up unit. So we are support firms, fintech firms, but also mid-sized firms growing. So put in place specific measures so they know who to talk to. They can understand the regulatory environment, and they can get support in navigating it.
Investors or firms?
Firms.
Right.
Firms. And speaking from a PRA's perspective, those are the firms that we regulate. And then from a scaling up from a banking perspective, we also announced today that we were going to be changing. We announced a couple of things that will significantly support mid-sized banks in growing and being able to compete with larger firms. So first is a much more efficient way of achieving model approval, which enables them to have more risk-sensitive capital requirements, so they can lend more, support households and businesses more, scale up and compete with the large firms. And we also announced thresholds for our resolution regimes. That was my colleagues in the Bank of England in our resolution authority who announced new thresholds for when bail-in capital would have to be held by firms, supporting again those mid-sized banks from scaling up and competing with larger institutions.
And is there anything from an wider investment perspective that you're looking at? So, because obviously we're talking about a global market, we're losing scale-ups to international markets.
Yeah. So, for example, again today we confirmed our plans for implementing the international banking standards, known as Basel 3.1 in the UK. And as part of that implementation, we put in place specific calibration, diverting from the international standards because the UK-specific data told us it was appropriate to do so for lending to SMEs, for lending to infrastructure finance, and for trade finance, all of which will support greater investment and scaling up of not just financial firms, but lending to support the growth of corporates as well.
Are there metrics you're trying to hit in year 1, year 2, year 3, having implemented that?
So we've got an extensive set of metrics that are reporting against our competitiveness and growth objective, which we published our last report in June, and we'll continue to report on those metrics going forward. Yes.
Anything else that you would like to add from either an FCA or a CMA perspective?
I mean, very briefly, from a CMA perspective, I think the key thing for scale-ups is making sure that we've got the conditions of open, dynamic, competitive markets that really are conducive to scaling up. And we hear that a lot, whether it's regulatory barriers, and we have a role, I think, in helping to shine a light on those regulatory barriers. I mentioned procurement as one example of that, but also making sure, and I think our digital markets work is a good example here. You know, you've got a lot of UK firms who are part of a wider digital ecosystem, and whether it's in terms of issues around access to data, interoperability, there are huge opportunities for us to build competitive scale in the UK that can then create globally competitive companies, and that I think we do have an important role to play in really working with government, working with us to create those conditions of effective competition.
Matt Weston.
Just talking about metrics, David Bailey. I'm interested to know when you think the UK might reach the same sort of level ratio of investment support from venture capital. You look at the US, it's something like 1.4 times for small businesses versus the UK. And when it comes to research-intensive industry businesses, it's 1.7 times. When will you achieve those same levels as the US?
I can't answer that question directly here, but we are engaged in plenty of research about how our regulation can contribute to growth, contribute to all of the supporting factors, including attracting investment to the UK. So hopefully that will put us going forward in a position to give you a more direct answer to that question.
How does the panel think we will achieve that? Those sorts of levels, comparative to the US?
And I think it is a combination of a number of different interventions. You've heard from colleagues on either side of me around the sort of financial markets, the financial system. I think from my perspective as a cross-economy agency, we're looking at creating those conditions. We've had a lot of conversations with private equity and venture capitalists about the opportunities to invest in the UK and how do we free up those markets to really make them open and competitive and keep that talent and that scale in the UK, I think is the other important element.
It'd be a good target, wouldn't it, for us to achieve? Do you agree? Parity with the US.
Greater investment, certainly.
Cooper.
Thank you, Chairman. I was very struck by something that the Institute of Chartered Accountants for Scotland said to us. We spoke to them at one of our round tables, and they say that in their view, robust, proportionate and purposeful regulation accompanied by regulators with the right powers can create the confidence and certainty needed for investment and growth rather than acting as a barrier. And I think that's something we all broadly would kind of get behind. But I think what they're driving at there is that you need to find a sweet spot between being overweening and over powerful and being too laissez-faire, being effectively paper tigers. Where do you think you are on that spectrum, David? If I could start with you, how are you doing? Are you the tyrants or are you the paper tigers?
So I would say over the last decade, 15 years, since the financial crisis, we've built resilience in the system, which enables us to ensure we have the financial stability that will underpin growth. And now we've got the opportunity to really make our regulation efficient and proportionate. So to your point, I think we've got a sensible level of resilience, an appropriate level of resilience within the system, but there are now opportunities to go and look at what we've done, make it more efficient to support firms growing. So for example, on our side, I've mentioned a few examples. We're putting in place what we're calling a strong and simple regime for smaller banks, which basically means that they have the same level of resilience as larger banks, but through a much more simplified capital regime. So it's cheaper to comply, it's clearer to comply, it's easier to comply, and it gives them greater certainty so that they can invest, plan their strategies accordingly. I mentioned some of the changes we're making to support mid-tier banks scale up. So that's all about making sure that we maintain resilience but ensuring that we're efficient and proportionate. Similar approach, Sarah's already talked about the approach to artificial intelligence, and we've got a lot of shared endeavours going on between the FCA and the PRA and other regulators. We're taking a flexible approach to regulation from the PRA perspective. So it would be easy to rush in with rules that would be overburdensome and constrain innovation. What we're doing is having a dialogue with industry so we can understand the risks, understand how much is covered by our existing regulation, and put in place and consider whether we need anything to supplement that in a targeted fashion. So far we haven't concluded that we need to take additional steps, but we're watching very closely because we think our existing regulatory structure appropriately captures the risks at the current time.
Yeah, and Sarah Pritchard, if I could come to you, I mean, you're trying to walk a bit of a tightrope, and we talk about responsible risk taking. There's a natural tension within that. How do you think the FCA are doing? And I've had your criticism that you're encroaching into areas that might not seem immediately obvious for you. You're touching on things which I would have thought would have come under contract law or even criminal law around bullying and harassment in the workplace. And you also seem to be putting quite an emphasis on ESG, the environmental, social and governance guidelines, which defence companies say is causing them problems when they try to scale up at this time of crisis.
If I take the last point first, you might have seen that back in March this year we issued a public statement because of concerns that our rules were preventing investment decisions by companies, particularly in the defence industry. And that statement, which I encourage anyone that is particularly interested in it to take a look at, very clearly explains that our rules don't limit that. It is about disclosure and transparency. There is a slightly technical area. If there are benchmarks that are referencing the Paris Climate Agreement, there are restrictions on including investments in a certain type of weapons, but absent that, our regulatory framework is permissive but focused on disclosure and transparency. I think
so just to back you up there slightly, so certain types of weapons, so you're involving yourself in the arms business. I mean, defence things go bang and we require them to keep ourselves safe, but you seem to be involving yourselves in that. Do you think that's within your remit?
I'm very happy to follow up with more detail on the specifics of that publication that we put out in March. It's quite technical and linked to some of the benchmark rules, but I'm very happy to follow up.
Back to my point about paper tigers, I mean, this looks great on paper, but is this message getting through? If it's very nuanced, very technical and very difficult, is that reaching the ground where the decisions are taken?
I think that is exactly why we put out the statement in March, because sometimes firms will say your regulation is getting in the way of X or Y, and we are really listening to stakeholders where we're hearing that. We're taking a really in-depth look, and sometimes we're finding that it isn't actually our rule set. If I give you another example, the work that we're doing to hopefully drive a greater culture of retail investment in the UK, we have really set out landmark reforms around what we're calling targeted support, so to enable firms to be able to nudge consumers, push consumers towards investment decisions and decisions around their pensions in circumstances where the current rule set, much of which is inherited from IFID, doesn't permit that. We have also heard, in the context of really deep diving with stakeholders on what's getting in the way, that our retail disclosure rules that require risks before benefits and require certain language is getting in the way. We've taken a look at that, and that actually isn't a requirement of our rules. It's industry custom and practice that has developed over time. So we are really taking stock. And as we seek to reform targeted support, which will be this new creation of the, which we hope will support a greater creation of retail investment culture, we're also looking at how can we help bust those myths, address those perceptions, and I do think that's important that regulation will often be technical, sometimes it is misunderstood. It is very important that we are explaining clearly what the scope of the regulation is and it isn't. And I do think when we talk about recalibrating risk, we're really clear that some of these decisions are absolutely ones for Parliament, for public, to set the appetite on it. It is by having that public conversation that if there is a change in the balance of risk, that risk appetite will endure.
I think we'd be interested in seeing that follow-up correspondence. Thank you for that offer. Thank you. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. This is really for the CMA, actually. I'm very interested in the situation that's going on in the business energy market at the moment. And I think many people feel that this is not a market that is functioning, and that whilst there is competition, the question mark would be, is there real competition and how is it benefiting consumers? You know, we've got limited suppliers, we've got price comparison sites owned by the same people, with little transparency around that. We've got unregulated brokers, and then the good ones really are swimming around in a shark's tank trying to make the best of it. So I was wondering, really, how are you regulating to protect customers by thinking about what your role is in looking at markets like this, which clearly from the outside are really failing?
I mean, obviously our role is a cross-economy role as the competition and the consumer agency, so we don't have that sector-specific focus in the same way. I know you've got Jonathan Brady coming to talk probably deep dive on energy in the following session, and we clearly work very closely with our counterpart regulators in some of those regulated sectors. Energy is one of those, and we will look at the overlap areas. Is this an issue which falls within a statutory regulated remit? Does it not? What are the competition? What are the consumer facing issues in there? We don't have live work active in that space at the moment, but it is something that we will take into account in that broader mix. More generally, I would say our focus is we have to look and prioritise at the sets of issues. We will get feedback from stakeholders, from consumer groups and business groups, and we are constantly adjusting and setting a course on what are the most pressing and priority areas for us to take action on. Again, very happy to take any follow-up in terms of the specific feedback that you have on that market, and maybe we can pick it up after the following session as well.
Be very helpful.
Very good point.
Yeah, just to follow up a little bit on that, one of the other criticisms we hear is sort of layering, and you talked about speaking to your counterparts. This is one for all of you. How many conversations do you have with your colleagues and other regulators about that sense of, it may be the regulation that you come forward may make sense of itself, but when you add it into Ofgem, you add it into and then suddenly it becomes prohibitive and unnecessary pressures on business. Do you have those conversations? Do you see it as your responsibility to try and fix that problem?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to take it first briefly, I think absolutely, I think it's a key responsibility for all of us to make sure that we are joining up as much as we possibly can, because at the end of the day, from a business or a consumer perspective, it doesn't frankly matter which agency has responsibility. You just want to know that things are working, there's no duplication, and it's operating effectively and efficiently. What does that mean in practice for us at the CMA? we will be working directly bilaterally with other regulators where we have an overlapping interest. So a good example with the FCA recently is that the work that the FCA had done in relation to digital wallets, we've then picked that up through our digital markets investigation that we're currently looking at in relation to mobile. I know that we've been working together on motor insurance as another good example. We work very closely with Ofgem, with Ofcom, many examples of that. Happy to go into details.
Just talk us through what happens where there is a conflict and a trade-off to make. So actually, what business says to us is not that we've got a bunch of anti-growth regulators, you'll be delighted to hear. Actually, what business says to us is that we've got one regulator doing this, another regulator doing this, and then we've got another department, generally DEFRA, doing something else over here. And it's really difficult for business to understand how conflicting trade-offs get resolved.
Yeah.
So when you've got, say, a conflicting regulation with, say, Sarah, but actually it's in both of your interests to pursue that regulation, who do you then call to get the trade-off resolved?
So, I mean, 2 quick points. I'm sure Sarah and David will want to come in. So there's one thing I think which is about just enabling businesses to better navigate those overlapping regulatory remits.
Really time-consuming and expensive for them.
It is very complicated. So we have in particular the DRCF, the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum, which is the FCA, the CMA, Ofcom and the ICO. And one of the real priorities of the DRCF is to improve the ability to navigate that system. We have run recently an innovation
That's just
hub.
putting the burden back onto business to sort of educate themselves more and understand the labyrinth that they're in the middle of.
To give an example, we've had a hub where actually businesses have been able to come to us through a single point of contact, DRCF. Don't have to work out, is this a competition issue, is it a financial conduct issue, is it a privacy issue? Come to us, help us with the answer, and then we do that triaging effectively.
As public servants, where do you go when your regulations are in conflict and someone needs to take a decision? This is what Parliament meant. Where do you go with that kind of conflict?
Principally, I think the responsibility is on us to resolve that. Again, an example from CMA's perspective is the work that we've done around competition and privacy. We have the DRCF. I think Rio is another opportunity, but David, you might want to come in.
I was going to come in actually, and we have a lot of engagement, especially with the FCA, with all the other regulators, but with the FCA we have specific mechanisms for us to be able to make sure that when we're developing proposals, and we've done joint proposals in areas like operational resilience, like remuneration, like our senior managers regime, that we can escalate within our organisations. And then we have, for example, Sarah's CEO, Nikhil, sits on the PRA board, and Sam Woods, my CEO, sits on the FCA board. So if there are issues to resolve, we can resolve them at the most senior level, and therefore the proposals we put out have already resolved any tensions, any differences by the time the industry has to engage with them, even at consultation stage.
That sounds a magnificently harmonious process, but what has been striking about the evidence that you've all just given is that none of it entails ringing up a minister.
Well, I was just, if I may come in with an example, but I was going to say sometimes there will be things that are not capable of resolution. So I give a really good example around targeted support, the work that I've talked about in terms of retail investment advice. We've heard from firms, as we've really sort of deep dived before we've even set the rules out for consultation, that they're worried about the number of consumers that they can contact because of GDPR, data protection regulation. So we involved the Information Commissioner Office in our sprint work, where we convened people together to help design the rule set. And we've realised we can't actually solve that through this mechanism, through writing joint guidance. We have taken that measure in other environments where we have done joint CEO letters between the ICO and the FCA to give sort of regulatory comfort to make the most of the rules. But in this situation, we say, actually, there is something that we can't solve. We believe it requires change to the privacy and electronic communication regulations, so that's a matter for government to adopt and take forward. And we have surfaced that quite explicitly then in the public consultation, where we have said, here's our rule set around targeted support. We recognise that there is an issue that is in conflict with the strategic direction of what we're seeking to achieve, and that therefore it is for government and for hopefully Parliament to be able to resolve that through future legislation.
Want to know anything further on that? Okay, Mr. Weston.
Just very briefly, thank you, Chair. It's just a question really about some of the scams. I'm not sure whether it falls to FCA or CMA, but you know, the fleecehold scams that people refer to about acquiring property, that they've been told by the developer, the house builder, that they need to sign today, and it needs to be through their solicitor, and it needs to be etc., etc. Where would that fit? Do you, once you're aware of these sorts of approaches in the marketplace, how do you go about ensuring that there is in actual fact the safeguards for the consumer that my colleague was just referring to? Because it falls between the two of you.
Well, I think it's probably actually another good example. Sarah will speak from the FCA perspective, but where we have taken quite a lot of action in the sector, in particular around leasehold properties. But we do recognise that there are gaps in the legislative framework, and we've been working very closely, again, to Sarah's example, to highlight those gaps and recommend to government what further action is needed to take. So part of our responsibility, I think, is to identify we can only go so far with this with our current statutory powers.
So you would have raised that to the Minister many years ago?
That is an issue that we have raised many times.
That's very useful. Sarah, anything to add to that briefly?
Well, again, there may be aspects that are within our perimeter. It will depend on the whether there's regulated firms in that environment. We are quite rightly in our strategy prioritising financial crime and what can we do to take steps using data and technology and also alerting consumers. But as Sarah has said, I think that is a specific area where there will be inevitably gaps in terms of the regulatory remit, whether that's between Sarah, there may be a limited element that we can intervene on.
Okay, that's afraid all we have time for today. The clock is slightly against us, but thank you very much indeed for a very quick canter through a very wide agenda. Really appreciate your evidence and thank you for your time. That concludes this panel. Order, welcome to this second panel in today's hearing, looking at the role of utility regulation, in particular electricity and water regulation. David J. Jonathan, thank you so much indeed for joining us. Sarah Edwards is going to open the bowling.
Thank you. I'm quite interested at the moment in the situation with energy bills and the cost of energy. We've heard a lot from businesses about how expensive this is. It's their second biggest cost, usually after staffing. And a lot of the stories that we're hearing are also telling us about a market that seems to be broken. And the question mark is it really regulated? But why are, in the first instance, is electricity bills, for example, for businesses and for households quite so high? And I wondered, Jonathan, if you might be able to comment on that.
Sure. I mean, when we compare ourselves to other countries, the biggest differentiator for us is this country's dependence on gas. So actually the driver for high industrial prices are the underlying cost base within the industry. So both for households and for businesses, that is the primary driver of cost. There is a secondary driver, which is the way in which we allocate network charges. Now, some countries choose to, basically for large industrial users, to reduce those costs quite substantially. Now, prior to the industrial strategy, we did offer a discount to those charges, but not as much as our competitors do. That's been adjusted as part of the industrial strategy.
In 2027 onwards, I think.
Yes. So the conversation I keep having, for example, with brokers who've been very helpful in giving me a lot of information is actually, and I know that you don't regulate them, but there's part of the problem here, and suppliers do come into this, because suppliers are supposed to work with brokers who are part of a dispute mechanism system, and that's where Ofgem can regulate. So if we take, for example, currently, if you move into a property and you're on a deemed rate, I had my activist brokers crunch some data for me yesterday, whereby they looked at 25,000 kilowatt usage, and they looked at about 15 suppliers, and the average price on the deemed rate was 35.8 pence per kilowatt hour and £2.55 per day. When they then, so that was the deemed rate, the move-in day rate. When they then compared what you could actually get if you moved on to an acceptable contract, which they priced in a small amount, 0.8% of a broker fee, it was 24.04p per kilowatt hour and £1.02 for a standing charge. That's a difference of 30% for electricity over a 12-month contract, and the same exercise for gas showed a 40% difference. So if you move in tomorrow and you're a business, 30 or 40% higher is that cost, and suppliers are very slow to move them on. That's just one example. There are lots more. So I guess I'm not quite buying that the reason that it's so expensive is just these other things, and that there aren't people exploiting the fact that there is low regulation and in the broker market, no regulation.
So look, in terms of the macro picture, those are the costs that I described, but just focusing on particularly small business users, what we saw in the crisis were a set of unacceptable behaviours by some suppliers.
Where,
and some
Jonathan,
grocers.
sorry, where we saw?
During the energy crisis,
Yep.
so in 22-23. Just to lay out the things we have done to address that, and these are new measures, so we'll see if they have the impact that we hope for. First of all, you've already mentioned, we have recommended to government that we are regulating brokers. So we're expecting, as part of the Energy Independence Bill, we will get powers to do that. That is critical, by the way, because many of the stories I've heard have been of people who signed up to 5-year-long contracts at the height of the crisis, and so are still paying those contracts today at those prices.
100%. But on the deemed prices, that's all the supplier.
We'll come to that, absolutely. Secondly, we introduced a set of standards of conduct that include transparency about pricing, transparency about commissioning, and also principal regulations about how you apply the deemed rate. So we do expect the deemed rate to be a reasonable reflection of costs. Third thing, and this is critical, so when I spoke to people who were affected incredibly badly by that behaviour, one of their problems was they have nowhere to go. So the only place you can go is to court to try and resolve your problem. So we have extended the powers of the Ombudsman, or the government has on our recommendation, at the end of this year to make sure we have a dispute resolution service. So coming back to your comment on deemed rates and what are offered, people now have a place to go to say what I've been charged is too high. Before, you'd be expected to get your own lawyer and to take that to court, which is obviously too difficult to do. And finally, particularly for small businesses, we have extended the role of citizens' advice so that actually they are able to provide people with the sort of advice you get as a domestic customer to make sure that you can address these issues with your company and you can take complaints to the Ombudsman. So we've put in a package of reforms that we expect to change the business market that we see. If they don't succeed, we'll have to come in with harder edge regulation. But this is always a trade-off. If I
can just come back on the deemed rates. So the phrase used is that the rates should not be unduly onerous and that they should be cost-effective and published transparently. Is that happening?
So as far as we set these rules up now, we are monitoring them, but as far as we can see, but we will continue to monitor them against retailers. And
you're monitoring them. What happens? And what does unduly onerous mean? Do you think that 30% higher, 40% higher is not unduly onerous?
Look, I can't comment on individual cases. Part of it is about the credit rating of people who are on the other end of that contract.
I mean, that was an average taken of 15 suppliers yesterday in Yorkshire.
So that contract was, yes. So look, I can't comment on the individual case, as you'll understand. But for example, we've already taken action against Maxon Energy, where we did find breaches against these regulations, so we will continue to do so. So look, we are changing this market. Without a doubt, what I saw a year and a half, 2 years ago is not acceptable, and that's why we put that set of measures in place.
How do we end up in this position?
Well, I think that, in a sense, when we look back at the history of the business market, there was a dramatic change in the underlying pricing that we saw in the crisis. And I think we saw different parts of the market take advantage. Now, my principal concern, and I have sat with shopkeepers who have lost shops because of this, is the role of some of the brokers that are there. Now, that's an unregulated market. We have bid before to be able to regulate it. We are going to be regulating it in the future.
How did we end up in a situation where people were just able to behave in this way?
Well, it's simply because, I mean, there's a wider question in energy in my mind, So we are moving from a system 20 years ago where we had a small number of companies running big power stations to supply customers to a much more fragmented market now. The kind of regulation we want to introduce for brokers, I think we're going to need in other parts of the market as well. And it's simply that lack of regulation that led to that point.
So we basically had a situation where there was a free-for-all and a small number of predators, maybe it was a large number of predators, were able to just milk small business in a way that was uncontrolled.
Well, I think if you look, when you look at the brokers market, I'm not sitting here saying that every broker is a predator, but without a doubt, there were some people that pressured customers into taking contracts that I think was against their interest. That's why we want to have it regulated.
And they were allowed to get away with it.
And there was no rules in place that was able to stop them, or legal powers to do so.
And you're now telling us today that the rules that are coming into force will end that behaviour.
So there's two sets. There's the standards of conduct for the retailers, but there's also this regulation of brokers and the ombudsman. So when I think about regulation, it's not just about the rule setter and the rule enforcer. It's about where do you go when you have a problem. It is much better for any customer, unless you are large enough scale to be able to have your own energy team, your own legal team, to be able to go to the ombudsman and get a resolution for your problem.
The misbehaviour that we saw in the past, which you very eloquently described today, that will no longer be possible under the new rules that are coming into force.
That is what I expect. If these rules don't work for any reason, we'll come back and we'll be firmer and tougher. But that always has a trade-off, because that gets more complex and more interventionist. And as you know, we have to keep a balance.
Anything further?
Yeah, I just wanted to check on the fact that at present I know that you can't regulate brokers, and I recognise that this has been a call for a long time, but through the supplier you can regulate their use of brokers, and there's been lots of cases where suppliers have not been vetting their broker partners, that those broker partners must be part of a dispute resolution system, and many have not. What has been done about that? Because you have that power, but that's not being used, is it? Doesn't seem to be being applied.
So we have enforced against Max and Energy for wider licence breaches, so we will keep monitoring it. But we did start by trying to regulate this through suppliers. The truth is it's just too long and too abstract. You need to go direct to the behaviour, and that's to go direct to brokers.
Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. So moving to water, why are bills rising so quickly? In my constituency, Southern Water raised bills by 53%. What is Ofwat doing about it?
So bills are rising, and that's driven by the scale of investment programmes in the most recent price review, so the 2024 price review. So there has been around a fourfold increase in investment. So investment went from about £11 billion over the price review period to £44 billion, and that has resulted in bills increasing. And in the case of Southern Water, they have a very large investment programme relative to what they've invested before, because they're upgrading a lot of their key water treatment works, as well as significant upgrades on the wastewater side. So these partly reflect action taken to reduce storm overflows, but more generally on improving environmental performance and bringing forward new water resources, which are much needed from the future.
My question would be, why haven't you pushed that in the previous 5-year cycle? Why is it coming now? And what could you have done to prevented this huge hike?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question, and that's something that we have thought about, and that's, I think, why there's also a review of sector regulation. But my colleagues at the Environment Agency are responsible for leading on environmental investment planning, and so that scales up what they call the Water Industry National Environment Programme. And so, for example, at the last price review, the 2019 price review, that was around £5 billion for the price review period. The most recent review, it's around £24 billion. And so we reflect those environmental investment requirements in the price review. But I think there is questions about how we get that balance of investment planning right, and making sure that we're looking out over not just 5 to 10 years, but 15 to 25 to 30 years. So I think that's something that in hindsight could...
So just to be clear, the obvious next question from that is to the EA, to Joe Nettleton. What was going on 5 years ago? Why were you not looking ahead appropriately to ensure that we manage our investment in infrastructure appropriately?
So I think that the way that we inform the price review is we carry out assessments through the water industry environment plan. And I think it's fair to say that we, over the last 2 or 4 years, we've really stepped up our game in terms of water regulation and also the input into that review. So previous price reviews have resulted in significant investment, but we've stepped that up to the next level now in the same way that we've stepped up our regulation of the water industry.
What happened 2 or 3 years ago to cause that step change?
I think the general expectations of society around water increased, didn't they?
Sorry, I shouldn't interrupt, but why did it take getting measures put in place which enabled consumers to be able to see what was actually happening? Why couldn't the industry and the regulators have actually managed that themselves without consumers having to monitor it for them?
I think my colleague, who is the Director of Water, Helen Wakeham, would be able to answer that, and we can write to you. But what I can say is that we have very much looked to improve how we regulate water over significantly improved how we regulate water over the last few years. We've increased our investment, we're bringing in more people, and we are carrying out more inspections. At the same time, our assessment of what needs to feed into the price review is, I think this year's price review has identified 20,000 actions that need to be taken to improve or prevent deterioration across the sector.
So why should consumers have confidence that all of this new investment, all of these new people, nice gravy train, why is that necessarily going to provide cost effectiveness and an increase in productivity? What are the measures in place to ensure that that happens?
So in terms of the financial and commercial side of things, I'll refer back to David, but in terms of what we regulate, that's the environmental impact of the water industry. We have increased our number of inspections. We carried out 4,600 inspections last year, 10,000 this year. We're bringing in a lot more inspectors. But what's really at the heart of our approach now is a very outcome-focused basis for our regulation of industry. So all our regulation of the water industry is aimed at improving performance in a really intelligence-led way. We have a strategy that features right through from how we carry out our permissions, how we undertake our compliance work, and the enforcement that we take. So with measures around how well we're doing that, but also, to your question, how effective that is and whether we need to review that strategy. So we are absolutely on it.
And how do you feel that Ofwat and the EA and the water companies are working together now? Because I suppose the thing that struck me when I first was elected, that there is no strategic overview of how water is used and produced in this country. Do you feel that we're moving to create that, or was my judgment incorrect in the first place?
So I think all I will say on that is that clearly this is an area where there is a lot of scrutiny, quite rightly, and the Cunliffe review is very much looking at that and making recommendations around that very point, how the system of regulation works across water.
I'm just going to go out slightly to the previous question in terms of what we need to see is innovation and new ways of working in the sector, and so we've established innovation fund at the last price review. We've doubled that in scale at this price review, so that ought to provide a pipeline of really quite exciting new technologies in the sector. We've also been encouraging the sector to adopt smart networks. Effectively, a lot of the technology in the water sector has traditionally been quite old. So what we are looking to see is much more use of monitoring technology on networks, which then allows companies to design and deliver better services. And another area key is on nature-based solutions and nature-based approaches. And so we've been also encouraging the sector to adopt those. As Joe's mentioned, And as part of the WINUP process, we have trialled what we call advanced WINUP, so getting to more outcomes-based approaches, encouraging partnership working by companies and their communities and councils. So it's up in Manchester recently looking at integrated water management there and what they're doing between the councils, between the Environment Agency and the water company in terms of making sure that we're making much better use of water and how it's captured and stored.
David, you've managed to go through all of your answers today without once referring to the level of dividends paid out by water companies to their shareholders. Do you want to just remind the committee, since privatisation, how much has been paid out to shareholders in dividends?
There's about £52 billion paid out in dividends based on Ofwat records over the last 34 years. And if you look at the last 7 years, there's been a marked reduction in the level of dividends. So they're talking, we're averaging in the most recent years around 3% returns. I would quite agree. In earlier periods, they were too high. And I think when we look at reasons that drove the high dividends, we saw there were, I think, higher returns from financing outperformance, and that was something that was talked about at the Public Accounts Committee in 2016, so looking back at earlier review periods. We also recognise that financing costs were much higher, actually, in the period immediately following privatisation, so returns were just inherently higher. And then I think we're also very aware of companies taking on debt to pay dividends, particularly in the case of one or two companies in the sector. So in terms of actions that we've taken as a regulator, so up until 2021, we lacked powers to change company licences to properly police this area. We've been given those powers. In the Environment Act 2021, we've imposed new licence conditions on companies to regulate their level of dividends and ensure that they're linked to performance. And I should say dividends are an important part of the sector in terms of a privately funded sector.
Yes, and so are you inviting us to believe today that the balance between dividends to shareholders and the amount invested is correct?
Yeah, so dividends are around, as I say, around 3% a year. There's about £5 billion of new equity being raised over the last 5 years. So in fact, there's more equity being raised by companies than dividends being paid out in recent years. So I think the balance has changed. The question is, can we keep that balance right in the years to come as well?
In your judgment, is the balance now right between dividends paid out to shareholders and the amount of money that is being invested?
I think at a sector level, it looks much like it's in balance back to where it ought to be. There's still questions about individual companies. So for example, we took action to fine Thames Water when we believe they paid a dividend inappropriately a year or two back. So there are still cases where we have concerns, but if we look at broadly across the sector, we're seeing dividends.
What you've collectively described to us this afternoon is basically a breakdown in regulation for which consumers and small businesses have paid a price, while billions of pounds has been routed out to shareholders. So what we really want to get into now is whether there is a fix to this regulatory regime which is about to arrive. But let me first bring in Charlie Maynard.
Hi David, good to see you. Who is the ultimate controller of Thames Water?
So this is a question that we have under review. So in our view, it is still the existing shareholders in Thames Water who
David, sorry. Existing shareholders of Thames Water. OMES is the largest shareholder in Thames Water. Last May, 14 months ago, they removed their director from the board and they wrote off their shareholding. So how can you tell us seriously that they are the ultimate controller of this company?
So that's a question that we have considered and continue to consider, but the ultimate controller test is not just about whether they are exercising control, but whether they have the ability to exercise control. And at the moment, they still do have that ability to exercise control, so we think it's important that they are subject to
so the concept is broader than legal ownership, as you know. It includes anyone who can exert significant influence over strategic decisions. As per the High Court ruling and that judgment there, it's very clear that Class A bondholders are meeting that level. Do you agree?
No, that's something that we have considered, and as I say, it remains under consideration. We may change our position, but at this point in time, we do not think that.
Okay, can you explain why you think that the Class A creditors do not exert significant influence over strategic decisions for Thames Water?
Because they're not formally coordinating together is one example. So the creditors are still so they do have informal collective mechanisms, but they still retain the ability to act alone. So that's one of the issues that we're looking at in terms of the test. But it is, as I say, it's a matter that I'm not going to go into further details on because it is something that we do keep under review.
Well, what it looks like to me and perhaps other members of the committee is that you are flouting your own regulations on purpose, because by making them ultimate controller, they would have legal obligations which they no longer have. So we've got shareholders who've publicly walked away and said, we are not, our equity is valueless and we have no board representation anymore, and you are, as per the letter you wrote to me on March 11th, saying that they are still in control of this company. And then we have Class A creditors, which a High Court justice is saying has significant control of this business, and you're saying no, they don't. And it just feels very, very convenient for the Class A creditors particularly, possibly Ofwat too.
It's not a matter of convenience, it is a matter of our view about how we apply the law in this case in terms of what...
When are you going to come to a decision?
As I said, it's a matter that we have taken a view on, but we do keep under review. So if circumstances change, we have inquired of the company, we've got information, we have made investigations of the issue. So it is not a matter that we're taking lightly, it is a matter that we have considered and will continue to consider. And if we think it's appropriate, we will set out that view.
Right. Next question. Special administration regime. Steve Reed wrote to Alistair Carmichael on the 25th of June and said, however, we expect that any government funding required during a SAR, special administration regime, would be recouped after the conclusion of the administration. Do you agree with that?
I think that would be the intent of the government. Yes, whether that transpires will obviously depends on the facts of the case, which may depend on how long the special administration goes on for, and what the exit process is.
So running with that, what you're also agreeing is that actually the net cost to the government is likely to be zero, because they are likely to recoup at the conclusion of the administration their money, is what Steve Reed stated.
I mean, there's a question for the government in terms of what the government's view on that is.
I'm asking for your view.
So as the regulator, we expect the government would seek to recoup we expect it would, and again, this is a matter of conjecture and speculation. There's different ways a special administration can be financed, but we expect the government may be required to provide money for Thames Water in terms of cash flow purposes over the special administration period. That number could amount to billions of pounds, but again, it depends on how choices made by the government, and that's a question for the government. Not
right,
for
but
us
do you agree with the government's assertion that they would expect to recoup at the conclusion of the administration their funding?
So I think that's a reasonable proposition for the government.
Okay, so essentially the net in that reasonable proposition, the net cost to the government would be zero of putting Thames Water into special administration. Just sticking with what we've stated here, is that are you in agreement? As per what they said, Steve Reed.
That would be the ambition of the government in this process. But there are lots of uncertainties in terms of how the special administration process might work and what the exit might be. And so, for example, it depends on what value the company attracts at exit and how much the cost the government has incurred.
They are the super senior fund lenders, so they are at the top of the tree. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Next one, investment grade. So last July, a year ago, Thames Water breached its operating licence, where they have to have 2 investment grade credit ratings. They have not had that since last July. We're 12 months on. Moody's is now, I think, unable to state a credit rating as per May this year, because they don't have sufficient information, is what they called it as. How long do you think it's okay, and what moral hazard do you think this sends to the rest of the water industry and to other regulated industries, that companies are allowed to breach their operating licenses conditions with impunity, effective impunity, and carry on never mind? It's just like, why can't everybody else do it?
That's not the case. So we have reached a set of undertakings with Thames, which they're in the process of implementing, and part of that is about reinstating investment grade credit ratings. It's also true to say that that's going to take a number of steps, one of which is likely to be the restructuring of the business itself. They will have to secure new equity, and they will have to restructure debt in order to get to that position, and that's the process they're working through now. They've run a process. They've had, as you know, 2 bidders in that process. They're now down to 1, and it's that process which they're looking to resolve, and that needs to happen as soon as possible. In terms of moral hazard, it's costing the creditors hundreds of millions of pounds, or billions of pounds actually, to keep this company going. So there's certainly, it's not without its cost, and in terms of the ultimate cost to creditors could well be quite substantial.
With the Chair's permission, would you mind writing to the committee to set out what your reasoning is with regard to the ultimate controller? as to why you don't think that is
I will.
being
Yes,
met.
I will endeavour to do so. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in the water industry and the energy industry and how we've ended up with some quite impressive staff bonuses and packages for CEOs and others. And if we take energy, for example, the big 6 energy companies have received £58 million in salaries, bonuses and fees. The British Gas CEO had £4.3 million last year, which was only half of what he got the previous year, which is still quite staggering. And yet people feel as though, as I said before, the energy suppliers are acting with impunity and they're not acting in a way that they should be. So why is the money not being spent on improving customer service? And what is it that both regulators are doing about this? And maybe I can start with energy.
Of course. Well, again, just stepping back and looking at how we've approached customer service, we have been very interventionist in the last 2 years to improve customer service. We did see again in 2022, 2023, a significant dip in the sort of standards that customers should expect. Now, as a result, the latest customer satisfaction survey that we have run since pre-2020, we are now at satisfaction levels that are higher than they've ever been in our history. Now, it's only a smallish number of years we've been measuring it. And that has been because Ofgem has been very direct about the sort of changes we need to see. So if I take you back to one company, it's all public, E.ON, who were failing to answer the phone during the height of the crisis, so half their customers were leaving before they even got an answer to their phone call. We have now driven down response rates that were taking an extremely long time to answer to around 2 minutes. We've also spent a great deal of time sort of across the board in trying to set standards that bring standards up to a different place. Now, coming on to remuneration, we don't, within our suite of powers, have direct control over executive remuneration. I know my colleagues in Ofwat are getting legislative powers that we don't have. That is a consideration ministers will be thinking about when they think about the Ofgem review. But our focus really is about the incentives we put around companies to make sure that we drive up standards, and we'll continue to do so. Now, where I think we are now is,
drive up standards rather than drive down price.
So both actually. And I think if we look at our outcomes that we seek, fair prices, decent standards, resilience, and getting to a cost-effective net zero system. Those are the
You'd
four
appreciate
things
that your judgment about fair prices is pretty different to my constituents' judgment about fair prices.
Well, and I need to be clear what we mean by that. We can't change the underlying costs, so we can't change where the energy comes from. And right now, this country is very, very dependent on an international gas market that none of us in this room, in this parliament, in government, or in the regulator control. That is why we are really supportive of the government's drive to get to net zero, not just because it delivers on climate change, which is my background, but because that is the way you get away from a set of prices that frankly are being controlled by geopolitical events.
I mean, I guess following up in what the response is from the water industry around this point as well.
Yes, so I think the level of bonuses in the sector is unacceptable, and that has driven...
Did you say...
Unacceptable.
Unacceptable.
Yes, and that has driven a reduction in trust, so it's not just about performance of the sector, but the perception of customers that there have been rewards for failure. So prior to receiving the new powers that Jonathan referred to, we did introduce provisions requiring companies to only recover the costs of bonuses from customers where they could demonstrate bonuses had been linked to performance and were successful in stopping customers paying for company bonuses in many cases. The government has passed the Water Special Measures Act, which now gives us new powers to stop bonuses in specific circumstances, and those powers we are just received, but we will use those to stop bonuses where they haven't been justified, and particularly there are criteria around the level of environmental performance, service for customers. So those are and we will act with using those new powers.
Thank you. And just coming back to energy, the recent review that was done by Ofgem, which was sort of 80 pages long, mentioned business once in one paragraph. So from a regulatory perspective, we've got a huge number of customers out there paying exorbitant amounts with absolutely no price cap previously nowhere to turn to, and actually we'll get onto the issues with the Ombudsman, I think, later. So as a regulator, are you paying attention to the challenges that business face?
We are, and that review that we carried out in 23 gives us the foundation to do that. And I've listed the things that we're introducing to try and make sure businesses are better protected. We have wrestled with the question of whether we have a price cap in the business sector. Ultimately, that's not our question. That is a question that ministers will have to answer, because ultimately it will require a change in the law. I mean, there are real pros and cons there, though. Businesses are very different and they're quite heterogeneous. And it's harder than it is for households to be able to introduce pricing regulation in the same way. Therefore, what we really want is the behaviour of suppliers and indeed brokers to change. That's why we introduced the measures that we introduced.
Just each of you very briefly in turn, I'm just conscious of time. The Chancellor has asked you to regulate for growth. We've all talked, lots of governments have sought smarter regulation and maybe good regulation and stuff. Specifically, what has the Chancellor asked you to do, and what have you done so far, David Black?
So we've highlighted two measures in terms of the level of investment going into the sector. So we think that's important for growth, not just the £104 billion in the price review, but particularly the £50 billion of major projects that we have coming along, which will be really important for future water resources to make sure we've got the water to power the economy in the future. We're also looking at innovation, and so I've already referred to the Innovation Fund and doubling the scale of that to drive more innovation. And then there is innovation across the water sector. So this is about, for example, new ways of using microsatellites to detect leaks, new ways of promoting nature-based solutions. So giving us the pipeline of technology to allow the sector to respond to the future. And then the third area, those are the two areas that they've set out in our plan and the government's regulatory action plan. But we're also looking at what we can do as a regulator to regulate smarter and faster, and so particularly the areas around developer services. So these are services to new home builders, and how we can make that process more agile, and particularly we've highlighted the requirements to consult on each new site as potentially being a barrier, and so that's something that we'd like the government to address. On the major projects, we've talked about different forms of financing vehicles, so getting the Thames Tideway vehicle, the type of approach that is used, to be used more widely as well. So we think there's lots of scope and lots we can do.
Okay, Joanna.
Yeah, absolutely. We've committed to improve our response to planning consultations to hit our 21-day KPI consistently, to improve our environmental permitting service. We've put in place a number of measures around a digital portal so that we're easier to do business with, priority track service so we can track the most complex permits through the system to support people who are working in innovation, particularly in hydrogen, carbon capture, utilisation and storage. We've committed to increase our transparency. Transparency, obviously, really important. People want to see us regulating. That's massively important. So we've, from spring this year, begun to put online our assessment reports from inspections of water companies, and we'll be increasing that across other sectors. We committed to provide specific advice to industrial clusters around the environmental capacity and potential work with developers around potential solutions.
Yeah, that's fine. Councillor Britton.
So look, the way we put this to the Chancellor was you've got two things we need to do. And one is maximising the economic opportunities of all the investment we're putting in place. So getting the investment we need for 2030 at pace, making sure it delivers for customers. And secondly, and this is working with government, which is not only making sure we create jobs through the building that's happening, but we get factories and manufacturing located here, so we begin to export those services abroad. And we're working with the National Wealth Fund and Department for Business to make sure that happens. But then also making sure the sector works for business. So we talked about small business customers previously. The other part of this really is making sure that our retail sector is innovative. We have actually companies that have gone global from the UK market. So we need to make sure there is room for new entrants to be able to come in and offer different services. And it's public that Tesla have been looking at the UK market for a while, for example. That's a way in which we can both support customers and drive growth. And then really it's around the system that's there, and is that configured for industrial and manufacturing customers. So that is about working on costs. So I was really pleased in the industrial strategy we had the supercharger plus the British industrial competitiveness intervention, but also that we allow people to connect quickly. So we are working to clear out the connections queue so that we have a system that works for business as well as for customers.
We have a vote shortly and a minister to get before us now, so I'm going to just bring this panel to a conclusion. Any quick points you wanted to flag, Mr. Poynton? Ms. Edwards, anything further?
I think just a question on the Ombudsman is probably worth. We've heard lots of stories, and I've been collecting them about issues that people have had, and obviously the Ombudsman remit was expanded in December 24 to cover businesses up to 50 employees and some other criteria. But it's very difficult for businesses to feel that they get them resolved, and then the resolution might be, here's £200, which doesn't really cover for actually. It's not a penalty for £1 billion company to be told, here you go, pay this firm that's been absolutely smashed to pieces by this experience and had to go to the Ombudsman. So really, how are you making sure that they're actually going to perform? And in 6 months they've issued one maximum fine of £20,000.
So we know the Ombudsman caseload is increasing, so we know that they are becoming increasingly active on this. We will work closely with them. We do monitor what they do, and we're happy to look at their resolutions. So if you have concerns, I'd be really keen to hear them, and we'll feed them back in.
And just on their resourcing, have they got enough resource for this? Because these are complex contracts. These are not like the domestic market, and they've gone from basically doing domestic market to doing really complicated business contracts. Are they capable?
Look, I'm very happy to check in and see if they have the resources they need. They've not flagged that as an issue for us. They charge per complaint, so their funding model reflects the number of complaints that come to them. But look, there's a job alongside, I mentioned the Ofgem review, thinking about how the role of the Ombudsman can be made more effective. What I'm in favour of is actually seeing a much, much quicker referral to the Ombudsman. So in the domestic market, for example, we're beginning to trial not a system where you wait 8 weeks and then you reapply to an Ombudsman to get your complaint resolved, but where that automatically goes to the Ombudsman and they resolve it. As long as you give permission, they resolve it quickly. I think that's the sort of thing I'd like to see for businesses as well as for domestic customers.
It's slightly against us, but this has been an extremely useful first opening in our exchanges, and we will invite you back soon, I think, after we've had some exchanges of correspondence. The agendas that you're policing are of fundamental concern to the businesses of our country. You've described a pretty serious and significant set of regulatory breakdowns that have involved enormous costs that were unfair to the business community. You've told us a story about some regulatory changes that are coming in. We will want to remain absolutely on top of whether those regulatory changes are delivering for British business. But that concludes this panel. Thank you for your time. To this third panel of today's session of the Business and Trade Committee, looking at the role of the regulators in either blocking or facilitating UK growth. Thank you very much indeed to Justin Madders, the Minister on Point, for this, for joining us, and to Lord Willetts, and indeed to Chris Carr. Justin Madders, can I just ask you, as a Minister a year into the role, what have you noticed about the way red tape is getting in the way of growth?
Has it only been a year?
I'm afraid so. You look as young as you did this time last year. Any consolation?
Thank you. That is a consolation. Well, that's a good question, because I think that's a daily challenge that we face, and I think there's there's two elements to it. There's the internal decision making in government, the need to get sort of right rounds across departments, get the correct legal advice, the requirement for consultations and so on. And then there's obviously the wider question about how the wider economy works, which I think is really where you're looking at this. And clearly there's recognition there's a lot of work that we can be doing in this area. I think we're very keen to see what we can do to reduce regulatory burdens. We think it's going to be central to achieving our growth mission, and I think we've made a good start on that. I think there's obviously a long way to go, but we've sort of challenged officials on some of the assumptions that have been made, and I think that there is a great opportunity here.
I mean, do you feel shocked by what you saw coming into office about the way red tape ensnares growth? Or, I mean, how did you feel about it? Do you think it was kind of broadly in the right place? It just needs a bit of tweaking here and there? I mean, how would you kind of characterise your feelings towards the way red tape either gets in the way of growth or doesn't?
Feelings. It's always a good way to look at things, because it does tell you sort of it's the sum of your experiences, isn't it? And I do think there's probably been a lack of pace in decision making. I also think that, and this is partly from conversations with stakeholders as well as my own reflections, but I think pace, duplication, overlap, competing priorities, I think they all play into it. These are all things that I think we've identified in the action plan as areas where we can make improvement. I can see how we've got here, because every piece of legislation there's a question about how you best deliver that. Regulation has often been part of the answer. It means you build on, and what we need to do is really just look at the whole picture and see whether we've got the correct balance right.
Yeah. Lord Willetts, what were your observations on taking the helm at the Regulatory Innovation Office? Where do you think the UK had got to when it came to regulation?
I think, of course, our focus at Rio is very much where regulation is holding back new technologies and innovation. And I think that, sadly, that is a real problem. There's already a pattern in the 4 months I've been doing this, which is often the regulators say, we would love to do more, we don't have the resource, we've got other priorities, we haven't got the expertise of people who understand the new technology. There's certain kind of classic issues that come up again and again, and we do try at Rio to help with that. We have everything from the Chancellor's backing in saying this is a priority, through to some modest resource that we can put into things like sandboxes or extra funding where there's a real shortage of expertise, such as in the Food Standards Agency on plant-based proteins. So we try to help and try to exert constructive pressure, but it is needed.
There wasn't necessarily an ideological or cultural problem. It was more a pace, resource, expertise problem.
It is certainly pace, resource, expertise. Those are all problems. Whether it goes deeper than that, I think there is an underlying problem as well, that regulators have often been set up with a specific responsibility and focus. And although they now have to kind of take account of growth, their way of assessing risk does not bring growth and economic performance up centre stage.
There's a vote in the House, so the panel stands suspended. We'll resume. Order, welcome to this resumed third panel of today's hearings of the Business and Trade Committee with Justin Madders and Lord Willetts, who is currently performing his semi-democratic duty in the House of Lords, and will join us again shortly. We're going to now pass the ball to Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. The committee's heard a lot about the issues around business energy, and we've been pursuing this as one of our lines of inquiry. And one of the things that I've uncovered is not just the problems between perhaps where Ofgem is sitting and how they're regulating suppliers and that level, but also that we have brokers that are completely unregulated, and actually Ofgem don't have the powers to regulate them, and it's something which was identified over 12 years ago and the last government has not moved on. Now, so we've had a review in 2023, and so this is an example of where regulation, we've heard it's slowing business down, but in this case, it's a lack of regulation in this area that's definitely slowing business down and costing them huge amounts. So I just wondered if you might be able to comment on how departments are coming together to identify some of these other areas where we might say, actually, it's not always about regulation being onerous, it's it being absent.
Yeah, well, look, I think first of all, I would start from the proposition that, you know, regulation is not a dirty word. I think sometimes when we look at this, we sort of take the position that because regulation sometimes gets in the way, it's a bad thing. Of course, actually, it's really important for consumer confidence, for the wider economy, and actually for businesses to operate on a level playing field, that we have properly regulated systems. So it's more about how we regulate and are we doing it effectively rather than do we regulate or not. And you know, obviously, Des and Ez will have a particular view on how the energy market works, but really what we're looking to see is everything that we've got in there necessary? Is it still protecting consumers? Is it helping drive growth? Clearly, we have manifesto commitments in this particular department, which will increase regulation, but we are looking very carefully about how we do that, and it is really about the how rather than the whether we do it or not that's the key to this, I think.
Yeah.
So in the past, governments have had rules which help them think about deregulating or regulating differently. So over the years we've had rules like 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 2 out, cost targets for rural reduction. How do you think about the objectives that you've got for regulating differently?
Well, when we first started talking about this, I raised those very examples of how it's been done in the past, and you know, without wishing to introduce previous governments, 1 in, 1 out was not really the great success story, or 2 in, 1 out, or whatever number you call it. That I think was too crude a measure. It gave a good headline, but actually the policy detail under it didn't actually deliver the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, which is actually a fundamental question: what is this regulation for? So you can do 1 in, 1 out. If the 1 out wasn't actually being sort of observed anyway because it was out of date and didn't relate to the economy as it is, you're not actually gaining anything. Whereas if you're looking at regulations and asking yourself, well, can we do this in a more effective way? And I think that we've got, you know, some quite big strides to make in terms of digital. I think that's a really important point. But it's also about does that regulation conflict or take us in a different direction to another regulation? Is there enough clarity and certainty for those people who are in business to understand what is required of them? And those kind of wider questions are what we're looking at as part of this.
Okay. When the committee met Stephen Mirren, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Trump in the United States a couple of weeks ago, he laid out a 4-pillar approach that the president is pursuing in the United States. And one of those pillars was a very clear deregulatory agenda. It doesn't sound like you're telling the committee today that you have an analysis, which is that the UK economy is smothered in red tape and that is holding back growth. I just want to check that analysis, that interpretation of your analysis with you.
Okay, well, I think our view is that there is a need to reduce the regulatory burden. We've got a target of 25%, but I think putting that into crude numbers of regulations doesn't necessarily achieve the outcome that we want. I think it's more about the administrative burden overall that we're thinking of, which is about, is that particular piece of form filling required? Is there a quicker or more efficient way it can be done? Are people having to submit multiple lots of information to different agencies when actually it could all be done in a much more coherent way? So this 25% target is based on a similar exercise that the EU have done. Last time we were in government, there was a similar amount reduced in regulatory burden. So I don't think we would want to be saying it's going to mean X or Y number of regulations will be removed. It's about the overall impact on businesses.
Thank you. And can I just check, it's 25% of what?
Well, that's the challenge. We've actually got to get a baseline to start with.
Okay.
I don't know if...
But what should I be thinking about? Should I be thinking about cost, GDP, pages of regulation? It's 25% of what?
I think it's probably more in cost. I don't know if Chris has done a lot on this, so if he can sort of articulate it in a slightly better way.
The target is to reduce the administrative burden of regulation by 25% over the course of the Parliament.
What are we measuring, Chris?
What we mean is administrative burdens as distinct from the policy costs of regulation. So the policy costs of regulation are those that buy you the protections that the regulation is protecting, and the administrative burdens are the other costs, the form filling and the inspection. So if I could use the...
This is a time cost?
Yes, time or other... other.
So if my business spends 100 hours dealing with regulation today, the goal is to reduce it to 75 hours?
Correct, yeah.
Right, with all the... So we're not stipulating the cost per hour, if you like. Are we looking at pound notes when we're thinking about this number, or are we just thinking about minutes in the day?
No, we are looking at pounds. We are looking to, as the Minister says, we have to agree and publish a baseline of the administrative burden.
Interesting.
And then strive to reduce it by 25%.
So you're first going to publish a cost number for how much the administrative costs are today for the UK economy.
Yep.
When do you expect to do that?
We think it's going to take about 18 months, which is akin to the timescale it took under the last Labour government's similar exercise.
Yeah, so that takes us to, what, January 2027, ballpark?
Yeah. Roughly. I mean, that's not to say that the work isn't going on in the meantime.
No, I realise it sounds a pretty big task to me.
And I, there was a conversation, is there a way we can get a figure for the release of the action plan, but we just concluded it wouldn't be robust enough to rely on, so we want to do it properly.
Okay, and then the 25% target is for delivery over what time period?
Over the lifetime of this Parliament. Okay,
so the number will be published in July 2027, but then the cost reduction has got to be delivered by the end of the Parliament.
That's correct.
Okay, that's really helpful, thank you. Charlie Maynard.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. So roughly 45% of our goods exports go to the EU, and those goods need to be compliant with EU regulation in order to be sold there. We now have a growing body of UK regulation as well. In this post-Brexit world, are we more regulated or less regulated for British business?
Well, I think we recognise that since we've left the EU, there have been occasions when too lots of paperwork. There's obviously chemicals is a good example where very costly exercises have had to be undertaken. You'll know from the recent EU reset that we are looking at ways where we can avoid that kind of duplication of cost. I think that we will always be looking for ways where we can work with partners around the world where there are actually common systems that can help us.
I'm going to be a bit unfair on that. Does that mean that it is a more regular? We've got more regulations because we're outside, because we've got to be compliant both for a business operating? Is that fair or unfair?
I'm not sure that we've actually done the sort of
Okay, just
analysis
following
on pre and post.
Just following the logic of it.
Okay.
You know, you've now got European regulations and you've got UK regulations. You're a business owner. You only had one set before. You now got two. Does that mean you have more regulations or fewer?
Well, in that particular circumstance, you would have more. But of course, there have been a number of examples where regulations have been removed from the statute book as a result of us leaving the EU.
Give me some examples.
Well, there's the regular report we have on the retained EU law Act, which was actually brought in under the previous government, but a lot of the legislation under that was repealed.
Chaz?
Well, I can think of an example to do with recording of hours under the working time regulations. That was something that the previous administration removed.
Okay. Okay, I mean, what I'm trying to make, here we are talking very earnestly about regulation and removing regulation. I mean, the reality is we're now living in a much more regulated world, which is, and by the way, I give your government credit for trying to get, UK EU reset, trying to reduce some of that. That's great. I just really hope you move a lot faster than you are currently doing on that, because our businesses are going to the wall. Lots of industrial manufacturing businesses are going belly up because they've got too much regulation. It's hard to sell into the EU, including car industry and much else. So please move quickly on that.
Gregor Poynton.
Great, thank you, Chair. Just matters. In your opening answer, I think the three areas you outlined that you had concern on regulation that might be stifling growth for pace, duplication and contradiction. On the contradiction point, the CBI surveyed businesses, and 55% of businesses that responded to their survey said that they were two or three or potentially more regulators. And in the evidence that we've heard, and also a whole series of anecdotal conversations we have with businesses, they say that they are day in, day out facing contradictory regulations and contradictory regulators, and it's placing an undue burden on them. I'd just be keen to understand what you are doing to help resolve that.
Well, that is what we hear as well. So I think that the sort of the biggest initiative at the moment is going to be this single sort of point of contact, for want of a better description, for large infrastructure projects. And you will know that actually the record of UK PLC in terms of delivering infrastructure projects on time and on budget is not a good one, and that message that we've had, that actually you've got to sort of comply with Regulator X and Regulator Y is asking for something slightly different, which might contradict that. We hope to have some pilots where actually for some of the big infrastructure projects you've got one sort of front door, and actually then it's the job of I'm not quite sure who will be in charge, but it won't be up to the business to decide where to go. It will sort of all be done through this single point of contact. I'm not quite sure how far we are along the road in terms of announcements on that, Chris. Is there anything more we can say on that?
I don't think so. I don't think it's ready for announcement yet.
That's for infrastructure. Is there intent to do that across the piece? Because for example, speak to the food industry, they have regulations coming out at pretty short notice that change the way in which they've been accepted, to understand what is a healthy product or not, and that has an impact on them in terms of reformulation, advertising and so on. But then they have DBT shouting for them to grow, and then you have health requirements coming in the other side that at very short notice. Is that the kind of conflict that you think you can resolve? Well,
I think what we're looking to try and sort of examine across the board, where different departments, different regulators are pulling in different directions, what more we can do. I mean, there's a question about whether we need so many regulators, of course, whether some regulators' functions could be folded into others. That might help somewhat, but actually any kind of intelligence you have on where we are sort of sending out sort of slightly conflicting messages about what the requirements are will be really helpful in terms of steering us through this action plan.
I will feedback on that. I have a list.
Thank you very much. I mean, Louise Kingman from BP told us that If you want to get investment to flow in the clean energy sector, you need to join up the National Wealth Fund, GB Energy, several government departments and a number of regulators. City UK have said they're in desperate need of a real clarity, was their phrase, about what government is doing cross-departmentally. And so, we hear time and time again, businesses say, well, look, I've got 3 or 4 different regulators to submit to. I've got to submit thousands of times to this regulator while my European business might submit a dozen times. I've then got to coordinate with 2 departments which have got conflicting regulation. Generally, people either say it's DEFRA or DNES, by the way. Look, we've all been around a long time and we've all seen this picture many times. I suppose the question in my mind is, how do we ensure that there is a clearinghouse where business can take conflicting regulations and ask for the conflict to be resolved while they're still in business? This was a recommendation that we made in the Industrial Strategy report that we published about a month ago. How do you think about delivering on this kind of problem?
Yeah, it's this who watches the watchdog sort of question to some extent. But
well, who puts the watchdogs in a straight line, I think?
Yeah. Well, I think probably our starting point would be that the strategic steers that will be issued will have a degree of cohesion about them, and clearly that will be putting an emphasis on growth and securing investment, but also actually making sure that decisions are taken in a timely manner, that there is some consistency across the piece. In terms of the question about sort of, I mean, are you thinking sort of who's the arbitrator when you've got 2 regulators?
Well, no, where's the clearinghouse? I mean, you may have missed the evidence from the CMA, PRA and FCA this afternoon, but when asked how they resolved conflicting regulations, what they described is a process that essentially entails having a lot of meetings with each other and then, as a final resort, writing to a minister. How long that process take, heaven knows. But what there isn't, from the business point of view, is a clear, clean process for saying, look, we've got 3 different departments or regulators asking for different things here. Can someone just sort this out, please?
Yeah, I did hear that comment, and I found it quite interesting. I've not had that sort of letter yet in my role.
Well, I realise it's only a year in, so I mean, it could be that this process takes many years to find its way to a minister.
And that, of course, is actually part of the problem, isn't it? So, look, we're absolutely clear that there's got to be independence for regulators, but I guess it's about us trying to understand where that balance lies between delivering on our objectives to get speedier decision making and actually encourage that pipeline investment, but obviously retaining that operational independence. I think that's probably something that we will need to sort of consider a little bit further, actually.
Okay, Lord Willetts, you must see these kind of conflicts arise quite frequently in the areas that you're looking at.
Yes, and what we are doing is we are promoting the creation of networks of regulators, because often when you're talking about a general purpose technology, there are different regulators depending on what the application is. And there is a logic to that, have a regulatory regime if this new treatment is going to go into a human as against being put on the soil or being incorporated in equipment. So we have promoted the creation of the Engineering Biology Regulatory Network. There's already a digital regulatory forum. And what we try to get out of those is, first of all, to publicise the membership, so that someone working in this area with a startup or whatever can see the different regulators with an account of what each regulator does. And then one of the minimal things we aim for is that, if at all possible, decisions should be simultaneous, not sequential. What the startup companies say to us is they hate it when they finally got clearance from the CAA to fly the drones, and then, because they wish to drop pellets on the fields, they need the health and safety executive to clear the use of the drones to drop pellets on the fields. And if only someone had explained to them at the beginning that they needed that regulatory clearance as well, if it does remain with a separate regulator, at least could they just put the whole thing in at the same time? So we're trying to make things more simultaneous as a minimum prize for getting the different regulators around the table.
Who governs these networks? Who's in charge of this network?
There is not a super regulator with any legal powers over them, but we do think that part of the way in which we can contribute at Rio is we can be a coordinator, an advocate, we can cajole, so we can help bring these groups together and we can help explain to them how they can, between them, make the journey through regulation much easier for a startup. Yeah, so we can be constructive.
You're obviously a very persuasive chair, but do you find yourself having to knock heads together with some force to get some of the action that you're trying to ensure happens?
Yeah, you can. As I said earlier, the very rarely do the regulators just say this is all a bad idea. They're much more likely to say things we'd love to help, but sadly we're all too busy and we've got other priorities. And the backing of ministers and from DBT, as well as the ministers I report to in DSET and the Chancellor, does help bring people together. And we are trying, therefore, to shorten the period for getting to market with full regulatory clearance. That's one of the big prizes.
So this is quite an innovative bit of public service reform, it seems to us. Do you think, based on admittedly quite early experience, that this is the kind of approach that could be widened across government to other fields of regulation?
We have a particular role in Rio. Our job is where new technology and innovation is being held back by regulation. I do think it is quite a good model. It starts with the Regulatory Horizons Council, which was already established by the previous government and actually did produce some very valuable report. So although we've got lots of problems, if I may cite from their work preceding Rio an example of success, which is that they very persuasively argued in a report that nuclear fusion was nothing like nuclear fission, and it would be wrong for fusion to be regulated as if it's fission. One of the reasons why the UK is making good progress on fusion is it has nothing to do with the nuclear regulatory organisation set up for nuclear fission. There are countries where they think it's all nuclear, we'll stick it together. So, and that was because of a piece of work by the Regulatory Horizons Council. That's where good evidence, persuasive evidence from outside experts can help. Our job at Rio, coming in, created by this government, we see as partly to be the operational arm of the Regulatory Horizons Council. We want to do specific stuff, granular stuff, and using the resources of DSIT, which is closer to new technologies and has technology teams tracking these technologies, it means that we've got a flow of up-to-date information. And if I may add, I think the third thing, which is quite handy, is that the minister to whom I immediately report, Patrick Vallance, of course, and then Peter Kyle, Patrick Vallance was around through the COVID crisis. And he quite often observes the lessons through the COVID crisis of how everything speeded up and how little required any legislative change to speed it up. It just all got faster. And he regularly challenges me and, in the meetings we share with regulators, if we could speed it up during the COVID crisis, can't we maintain some of the pace now?
Now, if I substituted the word growth for innovation in your mission, could you not take the same approach to growth more generally?
Well, I am serving the government in the role that the government has defined for Rio. My job is to get on with doing the task of Rio as set out in the government's plans, which I'm very happy and proud.
You have a distinguished track record as a public sector reformer, and so what I'm asking you is to draw lessons from your early experience and speculate as to whether the same approach might work across a broader waterfront of government.
We have an excellent minister with the wider responsibility for it sitting beside me. I think actually having something distinctive around technology and innovation makes a lot of sense. Some of the issues are different. There's often just an assumption in the regulations about how things are done that needs to be changed. So I think having a distinctive technology innovation role makes sense. And I think when you look at the government's wider action plan this March, I mean, they are trying to apply some of the same pace to other areas of regulation where technology is not involved, and that's led by DBT.
Minister Matters, he's early in the role, but he looks like he's making a bit of progress. I mean, is this the kind of approach that could be, do you think, extended across the waterfront of regulation to help foster faster growth?
I certainly think there are going to be elements of it that we will want to sort of take up. Clearly, there's a difference between bringing a new product to market, particularly some of the things Willetts talks about are very novel, and it's almost a question, well, where do we even go to have the conversation to start with? But actually, what we're looking at obviously is not just new products to market and innovative solutions. It's about the whole system and established businesses, established processes. How can we streamline those? So I think there will definitely be bits from it that we will be able to learn from, but I don't think it will be the entire answer.
It sounds like you've taken some quite novel approaches in new technologies and in infrastructure that could perhaps generate some lessons that might be generalised in the future.
I'd be surprised if there weren't any.
Okay, thank you. Matt Weston.
Sure, I think I'll pass. I think we've covered that adequately. Thank you.
Perfect. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Chairman. We're always told that the two certainties are death and taxes, but I think we can add to that every government of whatever stripe will come in and promise to ignite a bonfire of the quangles and, yes, slash red tape. But, I mean, government is a red tape creation machine, isn't it? If we could monetise that, we'd all be on easy street. Where do you think you're going to succeed where others have failed? If I come to you first, Lord Willetts, perhaps.
Well, as I said, I think we can. There are some relatively new tools. There's the regulatory sandbox, which was developed initially for the financial services industry, and we are rapidly applying in areas of new technology. For example, plant-based protein and driving change in the Food Standards Agency, which is an excellent body, but is, going back to actually a previous line of questions, has been totally bogged down in post-Brexit writing of UK domestic regulations for food as we in Brexit Britain. And we found that we can help by speeding up the process of then appraising innovation in plant-based protein, which they were not otherwise going to prioritise. We think we can help with that. And we can also help on clarity. And I've noticed that the committee, including in your report, talks about clarity. And clarity in regulation means has a range of meanings. But one area where we can help is that in key areas of technology, we use language too sloppily for the innovators. So AI is one of the areas we work on. People are told that if you're going to use data, it has to be pseudonymized and or anonymized. What does that exactly mean? How can you be confident that the way you have put your data into a pseudonymous or anonymous form is going to pass muster with the Information Commissioner's Office or Ofgem? And part of the advantage of sitting in a science and technology department is that's an area where it may look like you're being fussy, but actually clarity, so that an innovator who's trying to produce better medical diagnostics using medical data can be confident that their company's process passes muster. So we do quite a bit on that. I mean, when it comes to precision engineered crops, there is, you can release them, you can have contained use. Contained use has a special regime. What constitutes contained use? If you have fermented it and put it into a container and then carry the container to a different location, is that fully contained use or not? And what you find when you get close up, the companies, when they ask for clarity in these technology areas, they think some lay people have written some broad regulations and nobody has defined for them satisfactorily exactly what these terms mean. And we think sometimes precision can help technologists, and that's where we might be able to add value.
Minister, we've heard there about precision. you talked about crude numbers, and obviously you wouldn't be so foolish as to put a figure on what you're going to... Oh, you have put a number on that. So I'm not sure how your 25% cut is any different to the crude stuff that went with those other regimes. But anyway, what's going to be different this time?
So look, that's a perfectly fair challenge, and that's actually the challenge I put back to officials during these discussions, because you're right to be a little wary about we've been here before, but this is I think I've tested this. I think there are lots of ways that we can make advances. Look, first of all, there's a clear political direction from the top, from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. It's important that is maintained, because quite often.
What is this? And I've heard the Prime Minister of the Chamber say this. He said he was going to cut red tape, and one of the things that we've seen is the Employment Rights Bill is actually, by your own estimate, is actually going to add to business costs. So there's a slight disconnect there, is there not?
Well, we've kind of made the distinction between those areas where there will be additional legislation, but also it's how you do it, and taking into account the fact that it's important to distinguish policy outcomes from regulatory burden as well. I know you can't always do that, but that's part of the thinking. But look, there's, I think, a great deal of scope and merit in clearing up the strategic steers for the regulators, making sure that they're cohesive, actually putting in the growth duty at the centre of their steers. The industrial strategy, I think, has got a number of challenges in some of the sectors that have been identified in the industrial strategy for growth. But it's also, I think, about thinking imaginatively about digital use. There's no doubt that at the moment it is lacking in sort of up-to-date technology and how we actually record a lot of these things. So it isn't about one sort of particular intervention that's going to make the difference. I think a clear political steer which is consistent throughout the length of this Parliament, and we've already discussed that this is going to take some time. It's about creating a consistent model across all the regulators, and that's got to be sort of something that's supported and adhered to by the departments as well. And then it's thinking about all the different measures that we can do. Look, I'm much more confident about this than I was when we first talked about this, because actually there are a lot of areas where I think some real gains can be made.
Okay. Well, Mr. Manners, Lord Willetts, Mr. Carr, thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. This has been an initial foray for the committee into regulatory matters, but we've definitely generated a number of questions that we're going to pursue, and we look forward to submitting our advice and recommendations to you. But for now, that concludes this panel. That concludes this session.